Whites did. So anyway, that's just an indication of the organized resistance. Now, what was going on here in New Brunswick? It's really interesting because here's a university town, and you would expect there to be very large protests, and there really were a lot fewer here in New Brunswick than in other areas. People pretty much stuck to where they were. You have to think of like what Rutgers was like back then as well. It was a small college. The state, it was related to the state, but still hadn't really been, it was still not a state university. Only 3,000 students in the whole university. Today they're 50,000. But there was an incident that very much changed the landscape at the college, and it's come to known as the Bergell-Hauptmann case. Let me tell you just a little bit about it and how it did affect how Rutgers and how New Jersey viewed the Nazi threat. This all happened at the quiet, idyllic campus of Douglas College, then called the New Jersey College for Women, or NJC, of Rutgers University. Right down the road from here. In 1932, the university appointed a young professor by the name of Leonard Bergell to teach in the German department at Douglas. You have to remember that almost all the German professors here and at all the other places, and the other language teachers for that matter as well, came from their mother countries. And so it would have been very unusual to not have a German national being hired. The administration of the university was very hierarchical. Very little power was invested in the faculty. Some of us feel that that's the same today. We have many more rights now. But rather, all concentrated in the chairs and deans. NJC was founded in 1918 as an undergraduate college for women, and by 1928 graduated more students than any of the male colleges. In 1931, it was accredited by the Association of American Universities, so it was a very distinguished school. The first dean, Mabel Smith Douglas, for whom the school was later named, created the German department in 1928 and appointed Friedrich Hauptmann as its first chair. Hauptmann, like all other German instructors, was born in Germany. He came from Saxony, born in 1890, the son of a railway clerk. He attended secondary school that emphasized vocational rather than scholarly pursuits and worked as a salesman before entering the German army during World War I. He rose to the rank of deputy sergeant major, very much like an American drill sergeant, I discovered. As a person who was expected to shout orders and commands and be respected by his troops. And he definitely took that attitude when he became a professor at Douglas as well. He, like many others, was crushed by Germany's defeat and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. He decided to become a teacher and settled in Marburg, a hotbed of radical right politics, in 1921. After working for a few months as a middle school teacher in Dresden, he decided to leave Germany since he had no higher job prospects and was angered at the new social democratic government of Germany. He and his wife sailed for the U.S. in 1923. He worked as a laborer in Rochester, New York, before getting his first break in 1924, where he was hired as a German instructor at Gettysburg College with a 5-year appointment, which he never finished because in 1927 there was a controversy about charges that he neglected the German foster child. That's nothing that really affects us here today. But he left there, but was immediately hired as Rutgers as an instructor, and then appointed associate professor and then department head at NJC. He did well at first, and the department grew in terms of students and courses offered. There were 3 other faculty members, including Hauptmann's wife, Marie, a German residential house, a German table at the dining hall, a German club, and members of the departments took part in many of these extracurricular activities, and were not required to achieve distinction in scholarship, but rather undergraduate education and these aforementioned cultural activities. Some trouble began later that year when Hauptmann charged the newest faculty, Ernest Zoller, with being a communist and a proponent of companionate marriage, a marriage in which the partners decide not to have children, reserve the right to divorce amicably, and stuff like that. And so she left, not without controversy, but she left, and they had to hire somebody else, and that's when they hired Bergell. And he was very different than the other faculty members. He was born in Silesia, in Germany, in 1905, but he was the son of generations of Lutheran ministers and a graduate of the universities of Munich, Vienna, and Breslau, much more educated than the other professors, and was a specialist in comparative literature in that area, so he brought a scholarly bent to the courses. He came very highly recommended. And despite the negative things he had heard about the German department at Douglas and about Hauptmann himself, He accepted the position and did well at first, teaching the full load and involving himself in the community. Burgell and Hauptmann could not have been more different, coming from completely different classes. Burgell, the scholar, Hauptmann, the working class. Hauptmann and the other members of the department were German nationalists. Burgell was a liberal. Burgell's scholarship and liberal views brought respect from the students and other faculty, but disdain within his own department. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, Burgell condemned him immediately in the regime, while Hauptmann praised him. The campus became aroused, especially Jewish students and student groups, and Burgell openly challenged his colleagues' views. The debate went on, but Rutgers was relatively quiet, and there were fewer protests, none like the ones in Newark and vicinity against the Friends of the New Germany and other Nazi sympathizers. Most of the debate was on an intellectual level. Meanwhile, Burgell was becoming more and more isolated, having his advanced courses taken away and forbidden to participate in German club activities. He was eventually denied reappointment and had to leave the university in 1935. Claiming political bias that he was being dropped for his anti-Nazi views, Burgell appealed the decision. With much support from faculty members such as Selman Waxman and Jewish student organizations, the case was brought to President Robert Clothier, who ultimately concluded that Burgell was not competent and the dismissal was justified. However, there was enough of an outcry by now that it couldn't just sit that way, and he appointed a Board of Trustees committee, it was called the Ashmead Committee, to study the matter, and they went through, and tons and tons, there were over 100 people testified at this committee, and it was very well covered in the press. So New Brunswick now becomes the center of the anti-Nazi controversy that was going on in New Jersey in the 30s, and people were reading about this in the paper, and it's quite an embarrassment to the university as well. So Clothier has this committee, and the people who testify against Burgell talk about how the students really aren't learning, their grades are higher than in the other ones, and they're not being prepared as well. And so the committee finally decides that yes, it was justified. And Burgell leaves, and things are quiet for a little while, except that Hauptmann continues his activities, and he gets louder and louder and becomes more and more of an embarrassment to the university. And now Clothier is really worried that it's going to look like he and his administration were complicit in all of this. So what basically happens is they try to shut Hauptmann up. They force him to become an American citizen. This actually plays a big role later on. He becomes an American citizen against his will, basically. He does it to keep his job. And later on, that hurts him when he tries to get back to Germany. His wife and his kids do not become citizens. And ultimately, it's a long story. There's much more in between. But Hauptmann does leave for Germany. He has to go via, his family was able to go through Lisbon in Spain, because they were German nationals and they were able to get passage and get into Germany. He has to go through Hong Kong and China and everywhere else. He had to go to San Francisco because the Americans would not let him leave. And he finally makes it back to Germany and immediately joins the Nazi Party and is given a job there. He becomes the head of I have the name of it here, it's the Academy of Slovakia, which basically was established to spread Nazi values and German culture to the conquered lands. This was not really as high a position as it really sounds, but it made him feel important. As the Russian armies advanced in late 1944, he abandoned his post without permission and fled to Austria. He was later arrested by the occupying forces in late 1945 and released in November 1946. With pressure from Professor Burgell and others, Burgell, by the way, it takes him a long time to find another job, but Queens College is founded shortly afterwards and made part of the City University of New York, and they hired him in the German department, and he had a very illustrious and wonderful career there, and retired and did very well. But he did pressure the government in 1947, and they arrested, the occupying forces arrested him again, but really he never did enough to really justify any imprisonment. Hauptmann didn't. However, his American citizenship, of course, was revoked, and although his daughters returned and lived in Long Island, he was never allowed back to visit them. and he had very marginal employment until his death in 1978 in Salzburg. I have a lot more in the way of detail in terms of what happened during that case and how things went on, but it really was an electrifying experience in New Brunswick to have this, especially on a college campus. And you have to remember that Rutgers at that time, although there were a good number of Jewish students, there were almost no Jewish faculty, and the Jewish faculty that were here were very much concentrated in the agricultural school. Waxman and many of his colleagues. There were some illustrious Jewish alums who put pressure on the university to do something about this. And I think the university probably figured that they made a really big mistake in letting the thing go as far as it did, and then supporting Hauptmann. Hauptmann also borrowed all sorts of money and was almost blackmailing them when he knew that they had to keep him in good stead. So it really was a very, very sad but telling story. The clothier himself, was not really that enlightened when it came to these kinds of things. There were all sorts of quotas at Rutgers and at other colleges at that time. Even during all these protests and everything, it was still difficult for Jewish professors to land positions, and there were Jewish quotas for students and that type of thing. There was a history professor, a female history professor at Douglas College, who went to Germany in the 30s and came back telling about all the wonderful things that were going on there. And so it really, the debate really wasn't one-sided. There was pro-Nazi sentiment. Now all that ended with Kristallnacht and with the attack on Poland and all that, of course. But the Germans really got a real reprieve in terms of universities like Rutgers, as opposed to, say, the Japanese, which were immediately hated on the attack, and the fact that they weren't Western, I'm sure, as well. So there's lots to talk about and much more to discuss, but my time, I think, is long up. I've been seeing the cue cards, and I understand we're going to have a session now, so please, if you have any questions.
Any questions, feel free to ask about anything that Ron discussed. Just make sure if you ask your question, maybe stand up and just speak so everybody can hear you.
Yes. Was the pro-Nazi climate at Rutgers any different from the pro-Nazi climate at Princeton during that period of time?
Yeah, it's interesting because the person that they hired to replace Bergel ultimately worked out. They didn't hire anybody at first. And part of the excuse for letting Bergel go, of course, was the Depression and the declining enrollments at the college and all of that, and that they needed to eliminate the position. The person that replaced him ended up going to Princeton later on and served at Rutgers for about 10 years and went there. It probably wasn't too different. I haven't really studied the differences, but to be sure, the German professors, no matter where they were almost all German natives. Very few of them would be American citizens at that time.